Let's paint an Easter egg in watercolor and practice some essential wet-on-wet techniques and water control. I wanted us to keep it simple and beautiful with beginner-friendly materials and a limited palette of 2 colors. I will be using my favorite Quinacridone coral and this juicy permanent green light from Etchr. You can pick any combination of colors you like, blue, purple, or yellow for the flowers, and any kind of green for your leaves. And I made a black and white outline that you can download. I usually make these exclusively for my Patreon subscribers, but it's Easter and I'm guessing lots of people will be making postcards, so why not share the joy? You will find the link to this file in the video description below. I'm painting on 50% cotton paper. I usually use 100% cotton, but for 2 layers of color that we're going to paint, we don't need expensive stuff. This paper is from a beautiful watercolor starter set from Etchr, very well organized with some basic supplies and a little booklet of watercolor tips. I like the synthetic round brush too, so we'll use it as well. And since Etchr included black waterproof markers, let's use them. I don't often use them in my watercolor work, but let's add some decorative details. It's fun, but completely optional. The only thing you really need is 2 colors and a sheet of paper. So if you're ready, let's get started with the flowers first. All we need is a very light layer of color, and I'm working on the top flower first, working top down to avoid smudges. Let's cover the petals with a very watery mixture. I mix directly in the palette well. You can be mixing on a separate palette, it's up to you. And then I will show you how to add a little bit of variation with more concentrated color. Beautiful transitions that are only possible with watercolor medium. I'm gonna come back to these petals later, and you may have guessed why. I want the ones that we painted first to be dry and then come back to avoid any kind of spillover of paint, and by doing this I will create a very subtle edge between the inner side of the petals and the outer side. Here I will cover the 3 petals with coral, working carefully with the tip of my brush to leave a small white line separating the petals. Then I will dip my brush into paint, avoiding the watery mixture, and I'm going straight for the juicy concentrated pigment. I will carry it over to the wet petals, drop it right at the base of the flower, and watch it spread, creating a lovely transition. Yours will be unique every time we do this. It creates a very unique effect, so your paint may go further or stay closer to where you dropped it. Just observe and enjoy. You can recreate this effect anywhere you want, and I'm going to do something similar on this open tulip, and I hope you recognize that this is essentially the most basic use of so-called wet into wet technique, meaning adding pigment to wet paper. And you can do it using clean water first or some sort of base lightly colored mixture. You can use several colors at a time, but even with one it looks quite nice and adds a little bit of a dimension and interest to your work. Let's finish the top flower and the tulip bud using the same technique, wet into wet, and move on to our leaves. Again, only one pigment is needed here, and we will be starting with a very light mixture, adding more concentrated green as we go. You don't have to use green, by the way. You can use something more interesting like a green-blue mixture of colors as long as they're transparent. There's also a very beautiful pigment that I've been loving recently called Aqua Green from Winsor Newton, which is a sort of an in-between. There's also Phthalo Turquoise. So experiment, play around, use whichever color you find interesting. This is sort of a decorative looking egg, so even a brownish color or deep purple might work. If you've seen me paint leaves before, you know that I add a ton of different colors into my base green, but I wanted to keep one pigment here because it's actually a very good learning exercise, as it shows you exactly how far and how fast the color spreads. And it teaches you about water control and the particular qualities of your paper. So every paper brand is different in terms of the amount of cotton it has and how it was made, which makes it really difficult to show and teach water control. And to really master it, you will need to observe your specific paper, and no better way to do it it than using one pigment at a time, so you can see exactly how long it takes for the paper to dry. Over time, you will learn how to guess the rough timing simply based on the cotton percentage and the brand that you're familiar with. In this case, I have 50% cotton paper. Although it's only 50%, it's a really quality beginner paper. I'm familiar with Etchr products, and I have one of their sketchbooks that's 100% cotton, really well done. This one dries much faster than 100% cotton cold pressed, which I usually use, and if you're watching it in real time on my Patreon, you can see exactly how fast. I'm gonna move all the way up and work on this cluster of leaves. You can see that I generally start by outlining the larger leaf shape, and then I fill it in with my green mixture. The stem right here ended up touching a wet coral petal, and the green paint run into the flower, which I don't mind. It's a nice little transition, not too strong. And notice one thing about it: the more wet your paint is, meaning the more water you have in your mixture, the more it's going to tend to flow and extend into other areas if they're wet. So our tulip bud was already drying out, but it still contained a little bit of water on the surface of the petal. So when I touched it with my brush full of green watery mixture, that green run into the pink and not the other way around. If my tulip contained more water, my quinacridone coral would run onto the green stem. So that's something to note as you're painting wet on wet. If your two areas of color are touching, the one that contains more water, meaning where your mixture was more watery, that's the one that tends to overflow, run into the wet areas next to it. Let's finish the last leaf. I'm gonna double down on some of the details just to make sure they're nice and crisp. As I mentioned in the beginning, I want to play around with these waterproof markers included in the set. This is an entirely optional step. You can simply continue with some watercolor, but I'm gonna create a couple of bubbles in between my flowers just to fill up the space and add something interesting to our egg. So these markers are very suitable for so-called line and wash, which is where you start off with a quick black outline using the marker and then follow with watercolor on top. The markers are waterproof and don't bleed. In this case, I'm not gonna cover the little details with watercolor at all. I just like the thin, crisp line that they're creating, and I'm gonna just draw a few bubbles to fill up the white space. In addition, this is a good tool to add some smaller details inside the flowers, and I'm gonna draw a few stamens, just a simple line with a thicker detail up on top. Now we can erase the pencil outlines. The shape of the egg is defined, and we don't need the pencil marks to guide us any longer. So I'm gonna run my eraser along those lines that I drew in the beginning, trying to avoid the areas that we painted. Even though they're dry, there's still a slight risk of smudging things, so that's why I like these thin erasers. And then to brush off all those little particles, I'm gonna use my old cloth, and we can move on to the next stage. Let's add some details and definition inside our tulips, and this doesn't need to be super complicated. I'm gonna get a little bit more decorative than I usually get, and so what I want to do is paint a few lines just to separate the petals visually and add maybe some veins, differentiate the inside and the outside of the petals a little bit further. So a little detail here on the back of this petal, a few more lines. Notice, just like in our more realistic botanical tutorials, I'm positioning my brush in the direction of the petal, from the base and out towards the tip, and that helps, of course, with creating a better sense of realism even in a decorative composition like this. I think it's important to try to imitate organic lines that you see. The effect is just reinforcing the overall shape that we've already painted with some additional details. On this tulip here, you may recognize these strokes from my Ukrainian folk art gouache work. Starting very thin, I drag the brush down, making the line a little bit thicker towards the base of the flower. Few more details on an open tulip here, and just to show you how you can do the dots without using the black marker, I'm going to create a few more using a smaller brush and the same red color, but right now I want my color to be fully saturated so that these little details stand out and are visible from far away. It's a matter of taste, of course. You don't need to fill up all the space with these red dots. And another way of painting them, instead of trying to get that shape correctly with the tip of your brush, is to use the back of your brush if it's round, and maybe some gouache instead of watercolor. You can just dip it into your gouache, which is much more creamy, and put one dot, immediately getting that round shape as a result. And you may have seen that technique in my recent gouache tutorial on Skillshare, a really quick shortcut for creating decorative details that I really enjoy. And our Easter egg is done. Only took me about half an hour total. A beautiful postcard is what we have in the end. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. And if you want more Easter eggs, I just posted a 2-hour class on Skillshare and Patreon. You can use the link to access Skillshare for free for 1 month and try this class and many others. And of course, more tutorials coming your way starting next week.